welcome everybody once again. Thank you all for coming. And this is the Ragged University Project. For those who don't know about the Ragged University Project, it's inspired by the Ragged Schools. What are the Ragged Schools? Well, if we go way back in time, before 1870, free education in the UK was delivered by communities. Communities got together, shared their knowledge, shared their experience, and these community schools became known as Ragged Schools because of the kind of clothes I wear, roughshod, ragged. So myself and a number of friends thought this was a really lovely social tradition, and I understood a lot about the tradition because this is mostly how I learned. I learn under social circumstances through friendships and relationships. So we thought, why not get people who love what they do, like Antonella, and invite them to do a talk in a place where we can just share a bit of food, have a glass of something, and enjoy, dispense with the frills. So that is the heart of this. And I would encourage you all, if you love something that you're doing, think about doing a talk or doing something with Ragged University and sharing it. I know that I've learned through teaching. I've learned to become a better communicator. I've learned that I needn't be so terrified of standing in front of a room of people, that you're all pretty much here with supporting attitudes. So if you don't know about the website, raggeduniversity.co.uk is a website where everybody's welcome to write and publish to, whether it's citizen journalism, whether it's a thesis, whether it's an essay or a poem. You're all welcome to publish on that. If you don't know about the meetup group, there is a meetup group. So if you want to be informed about the next events, the coming events, you can join that. And I will stop prattling there and take a great deal of pleasure in introducing Antonella Sorace, who's going to tell us about multilingualism and investment for a better society. So please do welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Alex. Alex and I have been known each other for a number of years now, and we agree on a number of things, and we've been working together over the years. So I definitely agree with your mission and your aims. So let me tell you who I am and why I'm here. So I'm a researcher. I work at the University of Edinburgh, which is one of the best places in the world for the study of bilingualism and language learning. I'm not joking. This is, Edinburgh really has a very high profile. And we do research. I say we because remember that research is a collaborative enterprise. It's not just me. So we do research on bilingualism over the lifespan. So from babies who learn two languages together from birth, to children who learn one language first and then another, to adults, young adults who learn a foreign language, for example, at university, and increasingly older adults who maybe learn a foreign language in their 70s or 80s. So I really mean the whole of the lifespan. So I'm a researcher. I'm also a mother of bilingual sons. My husband is American. My sons grew up with Italian and English from birth. So I know what it means. I know some of the challenges of raising bilingual children. What else? I'm multilingual, and I'm going to tell you a little bit, what a bilingual is. So obviously my native language is Italian, but I've been using English for a long time. I also speak French in a decent way. I understand a number of other languages. So I'm going to tell you why bilingualism and multilingualism is good for you. And I'm going to, start by celebrating bridges. I think we need bridges, both from a scientific point of view and from a public point of view. From a scientific point of view, we build bridges across disciplines. So we don't only work, in my discipline is linguistics, but we work together with psychologists, with neuroscientists, with sociologists, with medics. So we try really to bring together expertise from different fields. And also, we need bridges between research and society. And we've been trying to do this. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our center called Bilingualism Matters and what we do to bridge that gap between research and society. Who's a bilingual? How many of you are bilingual? Raise your hands. Oh, I'm sure there's many more. Yeah, some of you are raising your hands, some you are hesitant. So who's a bilingual? Normally, many people think a bilingual is someone who knows more than one language, possibly from birth, perfectly, to the same level. And unless you meet that condition, you're not a real bilingual. Well, this is not the way we use the term bilingual and multilingual, because for us, whether you're a baby who learns two languages together, lucky them, like my children, or whether you're a child who has a first language and then they learn another language, but still as children, or whether you're a young adult or increasingly an older adult, it means someone who knows more than one language, even if not to the same level. So that makes all of us, I think, bilingual or multilingual. So it's a broader definition. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be two monolinguals in one. And that's one of the messages. Now, what we know from research is that bilingualism actually changes the brain. And it changes the brain in important ways. Believe it or not, it changes the anatomy of the brain. So in bilinguals, it has been found that there is extra cortex. So certain areas of the cortex grow in response to learning more than one language. The connectivity of the brain also changes. So there are many more connections among different areas of the brain that are in response to becoming bilingual, in response to using more than one language on a regular basis. Again, even imperfectly, even if you're not absolutely perfect in all your languages. So we know that bilingualism changes the brain. And are you surprised by this? Well, you shouldn't be. Because in fact, the brain, and all we know about the brain, from many different fields, tells us that the brain is much more flexible than anybody thought. So the brain is not just flexible when you're a young baby, when you still have everything to learn and the whole life in front of you. The brain remains flexible even much, much later. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that later. So the brain, the plasticity of the brain, the flexibility of the brain remains with you all your life, basically. So we shouldn't be surprised that bilingualism changes the brain because brain changes have been found in response to other types of experiences. For example, there was a very famous study some time ago on London taxi drivers. So London taxi drivers have been studied, with brain scans and so on. And guess what? They have extra cortex in the area of the brain that regulates spatial orientation. Now, why? Well, obviously, if you are a taxi driver in a city like London, you better have a very good sense of orientation, right? So that constant experience of driving your taxi around in London actually has an effect on the brain in this particular group of people. Musicians, musical experience changes your brain in particular ways. So that's another kind of experience to which the brain responds in particular ways. So bilingualism or language learning is one type of experience that causes changes in the brain. Now, a more perhaps interesting question for us is whether bilingualism changes behavior. Because, if it changes our brain, but, we're still behaving exactly the same way, well, this is interesting from a scientific point of view, but, is it relevant for our everyday life, for example? So that's what we're going to talk about in more detail, whether bilingualism actually changes our way of behaving, our way of thinking. And this is where a short tour of research starts. Are you ready? Brace yourselves. It's not going to be very long. But basically, I'm going to say something about research on child bilingualism first, and then I'm going to move on to adult bilingualism. Remember that I consider bilingual even an adult who learns a foreign language later in life. Okay? So we're going to focus on children first, and then we're going to focus on adults. And in both cases, we're going to distinguish between myths and misconceptions and the many weird ideas that people have, especially about children, and facts. What is emerging from research? So, let's start. About children, there are many misconceptions, but I'm going to mention only 3. One is that a bilingual child is confused, right? So, poor thing, two languages from birth, the brain can't cope with that. How can that child learn to speak any language properly if you give them 2 languages? And many parents think, in perfectly good faith, that it's better to wait until the child learns one language first, well, and then you introduce another language, but not together, right? Because otherwise the young brain can't really cope with this. Another related misconception is that if a child has another language and they're going to school in English, for example, well, that's going to be a problem, right? How can they do well in schooling if schooling requires very good competence in English and they have another language? So again, there may be some confusion. They can't really do well in English. If I may say something about my own experience as a mother, so my children are bilingual from birth, and they were always very good in English throughout their school career. They were, the top level in English. So, there were parents' evening. We went to talk to one of my son's English teacher, and this teacher didn't know that my son was bilingual. He doesn't have an accent. He speaks English, perfectly well. And so when I told her, you should have seen her face. She was totally surprised. Her jaw dropped, and she said, really? But he's so good at English. And that says it all. That says the surprise that there is Italian there, and still he's very good at English. The expectation is that, as I said, if there is another language, maybe there are problems in school performance. And the third misconception is that there are good languages or useful languages and not so useful languages. So there is a good kind of bilingualism that everybody wants. So in Europe, guess what? English is the language that 98% of children in Europe studies. That's the language that all parents basically want their children to learn because it's regarded as the prestigious language, the language that opens doors, the language that improves prospects of employment, right? But bilingualism in other languages, not so good or not so useful, or perhaps we don't care. So, for example, regional minority languages. So, for example, Gallic here, yes. Sorry? Which language is useless? I'm going to say no language is useless, but this is a misconception. These are misconceptions. So there are people who think that, some languages are not very useful at all. Again, if I may say something about my own experience, my mother was from Sardinia. Sardinia is the second largest island in the Mediterranean. Maybe some of you know. It's a beautiful place, by the way, go there. And they speak a language that is not like Italian. It's a different language. It's called Sardinian. My mother was a native speaker of Sardinian, and she never spoke Sardinian to me because she thought that I had to learn standard Italian first and then English, because those are the useful languages. And she thought that putting Sardinian in my brain wouldn't play any useful purpose. On the contrary, it would confuse me. Okay? So that's the kind of bilingualism, that exists, but people don't value very much. Similarly, some languages introduced by migration. We know that migration is a reality all over Europe, certainly, and beyond. So many people come from different countries. They bring their languages. Now, those languages may be spoken by many, many people in the countries where the people come from, but they're not really valued as assets, depending on which language it is. But in most cases, people feel under pressure to stop speaking these languages. Very often the message comes from schools and teachers. So these languages are not valued for bilingualism. Because the idea is that you come here, you have to learn English. Of course you do. If you come here, you have to learn English. But as we'll see, not at the expense of your home language. So these are misconceptions. What does research tell us? One amazing fact that comes from research is that very young babies can actually distinguish between their languages. Long before they start saying anything, long before they start saying the first words. So they can tell, and we have ways of studying young babies long before they start saying anything. So we know, and they know, when they're listening to one language and when they're listening to the other. If you're interested in how we can tell and what kind of methods, I can come back to this later. But this study actually shows that even a newborn whose mother spoke more than one language, in the last few months of pregnancy, when the unborn baby actually can hear quite a lot of what's going on in the environment. So if the mother was spoken two languages, for example, in this study, English and Tagalog, that child comes to the world with a special sensitivity to these two languages. Now, it's quite phenomenal, and it's quite different from the idea that a child is confused. And we know that as the child grows up, there is increasing sophistication in the way they distinguish their two languages. So, for example, they can distinguish the different rhythm of different languages, even when the two languages are quite similar. So, for example, Spanish and Catalan, quite similar from the point of view of rhythm, and yet Spanish-Catalan bilingual babies at 3 or 4 months can tell the difference. They know when they're listening to one, when they're listening to the other. Or Spanish-Basque, which are not similar, they are very different languages, and still, the babies can distinguish. So similarity between the two languages doesn't seem to be an issue or difference between the two languages. Babies are good anyway. Now, what about language mixing? Now, this worries parents no end, because we get questions, from parents about, oh, my child comes up with these mixes, between the two languages. Doesn't mean that they're confused. Doesn't mean that, we shouldn't have spoken two languages so soon. In fact, what research tells us with regard to mixing, and there are lots and lots of studies on mixing, is that, first of all, mixing is creative, so it has a reason to be. So a child mixes they often mix because they may not know the word, in the other language, in the language they are speaking, and so they borrow the word from the other language. But in many other cases, they mix when they know the word in both languages, but the word in the other language actually expresses the meaning they want to express much better than the word in the language they're speaking. So this becomes a communicative strategy that improves the message. It makes the message more better from a communicative point of view. And it's a strategy that children use when they speak to other bilinguals because they know they're going to be understood. They don't do this when they speak to monolinguals of each language because they realize very soon that they're not going to be understood. So creativity in mixing, also competence in mixing. Again, this is an example from one of my sons who used to say things like, Mamma, mangiamo patate crunciose stasera. Now, those of you who know Italian would know that cruncioso doesn't exist in Italian. Cruncioso is borrowed from English. It's made up on English, in the English word crunchy. And it refers, that means, Mommy, are we going to eat roast potatoes tonight? So it's a particular kind of roast potatoes that now in the family we have this recipe for patate crunciose, and I can tell you it's a very good recipe. If you want to have the recipe, I can give it to you later. I can tell you the secret. But basically, if you look at that piece of mixing, look at that. It's perfect from the point of view of the Italian grammar. So the word crunciose follows the word potatoes, patate, as it should in Italian, but in English, it would have to come before. So it agrees with the Italian grammar. The word crunciose agrees in gender and number with the noun potatoes. So they're both feminine, plural, and so they agree, patate crunciose. So they have the right ending. So that piece of mixing denotes very good knowledge of the grammar of Italian. And there are millions of examples that I can give you. A bilingual child, because they have more than one language in the brain, have a spontaneous understanding of how language works in general. And that doesn't mean that they know the grammatical rules. So it's not the same kind of grammatical knowledge that we learn in a classroom, for example, when we go to a German language classroom and we learn that, yes, you have to put the verb in second position. And that is a rule, and you learn it as an explicit grammatical rule. I'm not talking about that kind of knowledge. I'm talking about spontaneous, natural understanding of how language works at the level of sounds, at the level of words, and at the level of sentences. And because of this spontaneous understanding that comes from, the brain implicitly compares the two languages in the bilingual child, that means that there is better knowledge about language, what, we call meta-linguistic knowledge, with a technical term. So reasoning about language is easier, when it's necessary. And that makes it easier to learn other languages. So if you have already 2 languages or 3 languages, learning a 4th language or a 5th language is much easier than when you are a monolingual, you only know 1. But also, there are more and more studies that show that a bilingual child has a better understanding of the structure of the majority language. So remember the idea that if you have another language, you can't do very well at school or at schooling in English because you're confused. Well, many more studies now show that a bilingual child potentially has a better understanding of the structure of English here or German or whatever the language, the majority language used at schooling is. I say potentially because, it doesn't always appear. And especially it doesn't appear if teachers start from the assumption that, well, this child they need a lot of help because they have a problem, right? So often bilingualism, especially, from migrant children is treated as a problem. It's treated as a problem. And so, people think about it as a problem to solve rather than an advantage or a potential advantage. Now I'm going to tell you the marvelous effects of bilingualism outside language. Because so far we talked about language, and you may think, well, bilingualism, we are really talking about language all the time, right? Well, there is a lot of research on domains outside language. So, for example, bilingual children have been found to have an earlier awareness of other people's points of view or other people's perspectives. This is important to understand that this is a fundamental milestone in all children. So think of a very young child. A very young child is naturally self-centered. They think that everybody can read their mind. And they have to understand gradually that, well, if you're sitting over there, you can't see what I'm seeing here. If I don't give you enough details, you can't understand, what I'm talking about. So all of this develops in all children. So all children have to gradually decentrate, so get out of their own, self-centered perspective and appreciate that other people can have a different perspective or a different view or a different point of view. A bilingual child gets there earlier. Why? Well, because a bilingual child realizes very early on that not everybody is bilingual, right? And so they have to choose the right language depending on who they're talking to. So if they're talking to monolingual speakers of language A, they have to choose language A. If they're talking to monolingual speakers of language B, they have to choose language B. If they're talking to other bilingual speakers, they can mix, for example, as we said before. So their behavior, is adjusted to the type of people they're talking with. But that means that they have to get out of their linguistic competence and appreciate that not everybody has the same linguistic competence. So this linguistic experience is extended outside language, and it brings a better and earlier understanding that other people can have a different point of view in general, not just a different language, but a different perspective. And it's hard to underestimate the importance of this in today's society, appreciating that other perspectives are possible and potentially all important. It's very, very good and very important for everyday life in today's society. And then there are lots of studies that show other benefits in the domain of what psychologists call cognitive control. What is cognitive control? Cognitive control has to do with the way we pay attention to what we do. We all have to pay attention to what we do, right? I mean, no matter what we do, if we don't pay attention to what we're doing, we don't do it well. And no matter what we do, there are always certain things that distract our attention. Could be a worry, could be a noise, could be the telephone ringing, could be anything, right? And we have to be able to focus our attention on what we're doing so that we do it well and we do it to the end. Now, bilingual children have been found to have better focused attention. So they're better at paying attention to what matters or whatever they're doing without being distracted by other things that don't matter. Okay? So there is a flexibility, a mental flexibility in dealing with conflicting information so that, bilingual children are, okay, I have to pay attention to this and not to this, so I'll exclude it. You may wonder why. Where does that come from? It comes from the fact, and this may come as a surprise to you, that in all bilinguals, all languages are always on. They're always active at all times. You can't switch off a language that you don't need today. So, right now, I'm speaking English to you, but my Italian is very much active in my brain, and I'm actively trying to push it away so that it doesn't interfere too much with my English. And the same applies to the other languages I know. And if you're a bilingual, you do this all the time. You're not aware that you're doing it, but you do it. So this experience of, focusing on the language you need and excluding the languages that you don't need is reflected outside the language domain again and leads to better abilities to focus attention on what matters in whichever task you're doing, without being distracted by irrelevant information. And there's also better flexibility in switching from one task to the other, especially if the different tasks require attention to different factors. Now, beautiful set of benefits of bilingualism. Now, we deal with the media all the time. We deal with public understanding of research. And we've noticed that there are some new misunderstandings that are gaining ground. Remember the old ones? Confusion, problems at school, good bilingualism and not so good bilingualism. Now, in addition to those things that are still there, unfortunately, we have some new misunderstandings. So one, is that, well, a bilingual child is more intelligent. A bilingual child is a genius, right? So you have to improve, bilingualism really makes them smarter and it improves their brain. So these are just, two articles, one from an Italian paper. Bilingual children are more clever, smarter, and so on. Now, is this true? No, it's not true. I wasn't talking about intelligence per se. I was talking about certain, how can we call them? An extra gear that gives children an advantage in certain situations. I'm not talking about intelligence per se, which is a construct that is very difficult to define. So this is a new misunderstanding. But what we can extract from this, remember the third misconception, good kind of bilingualism, well, a language is prestigious and then, it's all very well. When a language is spoken only here and only by a certain, small number of people, why bother? It's the fact of having more than one language in the brain that matters, not which languages, not how many people speak these languages, not how widespread these languages are. Those are, from the point of view of the young brain, those factors are not there. The young brain doesn't know how many people speak English or whether Chinese is an emerging language because China is becoming a prominent economic power and therefore now everybody wants to learn Chinese. 20 years ago, people were not interested in Chinese. So what makes a language prestigious is obviously, the place that it has, the country where it's spoken, the place that it has in the international political scene. But this is irrelevant from the point of view of the young brain, because what matters is how, the fact that you have more than one language. And so from this point of view, there are no useful or useless languages. All languages are opportunities. All languages are resources. All languages should be valued as such. All cases of all types of bilingualism should be valued as such. I promised something about late bilingualism or learning a language as adults. So are there myths there too? Yes, there are. They're a little bit less prominent than the myths about child bilingualism, but let's have a look at them. So one very common myth is that you can't learn a language well when you're an adult, right? You need to be a child to learn well. I mean, if you're an adult, you can't really reach a very high level. It's too late. Second, how do you learn languages as an adult? Through grammar. You learn grammar and through correction. So you learn through explicit ways that are typical of classroom environments, right? And that's the way adults learn. Children don't learn that way, but adults have to learn that way. And the third common misconception, you already have a language if you learn another language as an adult. You have at least one language, your native language, and of course that language is going to influence the other. right? And in fact, for the past 30 years of research on second language learning, the main topic for a long time was transfer from the native language, as if it was the only phenomenon. The effects in the other direction were not considered at all. So what does research actually tell us? First of all, in Edinburgh, we do research on people who can become extremely good in a second language, even if they started as adults. So it is possible to reach what we call near native or native-like levels of proficiency in a second language. And so if people's like this, you may think, well, it's not very common, is it? Yes, it's not very common for a variety of reasons. But the fact that these people exist means that they have a brain, they're not Martians, they have a brain like you and me, right? So it must be possible for adults to reach very high levels of proficiency in a second language, unlike what many people think. Remember explicit corrections and rules. In fact, when you look at what a proficient second language speaker knows, most of what they know is implicit. So what they know explicitly, the rules, what gets corrected, it's just the tip of the iceberg, because the vast majority of what they know is actually implicit. They're not aware of why they're saying what they're saying, why they're using the language in the way they're using. Exactly like a native speaker of a language. And we do much research on this in Edinburgh. The native learning another language actually changes your first language. And this may come again as a surprise, because many people think once you learn your first language, it's there for life and it can't be changed, right? It's your native competence, it's your native language. Wrong. If you learn another language, it changes your native language in predictable ways. It doesn't change everything. It starts from certain aspects of the language, not everything, but it definitely changes your native language. And in fact, we're working on a very interesting hypothesis here in Edinburgh. We're thinking that the changes on the native language are actually the other side of the coin from learning a language. So the more your native language is open to change, the better you learn the second language. So basically, if you're good at learning languages, you are able to reconfigure your brain in such a way that we see a convergence between the first language and the second language in both directions, not just in one direction. And it means that if you're a proficient bilingual, you're not like a monolingual in either the L1, your native language, or in the L2, the second language. So you're something different. Is this a problem? No, it's an advantage. And proficient, and we think, and this is our working hypothesis, that this is what happens in people who are able to reach very high levels. If you look at their native language has changed in predictable ways to make that second language learning possible to that very high level. We found effects, cognitive benefits of the kind that I described earlier in young adult learners. So we did research on university students of modern languages here in Edinburgh. We compared them with university students of literature, where they deal with text and they deal with language, but not from the point of view of second language learning. And we found that, yes, some of the advantages that I mentioned before for children, so cognitive control, better attentional skills, are found in young second language learners who pick up a language in their late teens. But interestingly, these effects are found more and more often in older adult bilinguals. So first of all, it has been found that having another language and using another language throughout your lifetime makes you age better. In what way? It makes you age better in the sense that it delays the gradual decline of certain cognitive functions, which is inevitable and entirely predictable. Okay, so some loss of memory, some loss of the ability to pay attention. These are a normal part of aging, the normal aging process. You compensate in various ways if you are an older person. Bilingualism is one way of compensating for those declines. And so those normal, non-pathological decline, cognitive decline, follows a less steep curve. It's much more gradual. If you're unlucky enough to get a kind of dementia, Alzheimer's, it's not just, there are many different kinds of dementia, so we can't generalize. These effects have been found for certain kinds of dementia. The first symptoms of the disease appear on average 4 or 5 years later compared to a monolingual. When I mean the first symptoms, I mean the first symptoms that makes it obvious that a person has that disease. So loss of autonomy, loss of independence. So 4 or 5 years. If this is a very important result, if this result is sustained by more and more studies, that has enormous implications from the point of view of personal autonomy, because 4 or 5 years of independent life is a lifetime. For anybody who is familiar with how devastating these symptoms can be. But also for public health, more and more people are getting older, so there will be more and more cases of dementia. Now, this is the study that I briefly mentioned at the beginning. This is a study on Gaelic, so minority language spoken in Scotland, not the only one, but the one that is officially supported. And this was a study done on Sky, and this was an intensive course, 1 week, where all you did was Gaelic, right? So many hours a day, entire focus on Gaelic, and so on. We had a range of learners from age 18 to age 78. So a big age range, right? We tested everybody. We gave them cognitive tests and so on before they started the study. And then immediately after they finished this course, this 1 week course in Gaelic, nobody knew Gaelic before they started. So it was an entirely new language for everybody. And what we found was that everybody benefits. So everybody improves compared to their own baselines. So their own scores before the course. The scores after the course had improved. But the largest improvements, guess what? They were in the older people. So the people in their 70s were the ones where we noticed a largest improvement. Now, you may want to say, well, it could be because young people are good anyway at this kind of test. So it's more difficult to notice a difference because young people may be at the peak of their cognitive abilities. And so, whereas in older people, because of decline, you may find a bigger difference. But this is a very encouraging study. Again, it needs to be done more and more studies of this kind. But it shows that the brain is very flexible again and reacts, and the brain responds to the experience of learning another language at all ages. So these are, some of the press, delaying the onset of Alzheimer's disease, impact of bilingualism on stroke. So certain kinds of aphasia due to stroke have apparently been found to be positively affected by bilingualism in the sense that the chances of recovery are larger in bilingual people than in monolingual people. New misunderstandings here as well. So if you are bilingual, you don't get Alzheimer's, right? This is a classic question that journalists ask, right? And I've heard this question many times. So it's a magic cure, right? So we have the cure for dementia now. Obviously not, okay? Bilingualism has nothing to do with the likelihood of getting dementia or not. But as we said before, it improves the prospects of delaying the first symptoms of the disease. And we are not even saying that bilingualism is the only experience that does that. Bilingualism is one type of experience that might have this effect. There may be others that may have a comparable effect. Musical training, for example, is an experience that is being studied with respect to its possible effects on the delay of dementia. Quilting is something that Americans love to do. It is a new thing that is becoming more and more widespread. It's a kind of physical and mental activity that engages you, and so it might have similar effects. Physical exercise, yes, physical exercise can have, is an experience that can have positive effects. But bilingualism, is in language learning is something that is potentially more widely available than either musical training or quilting or, certain kinds of physical exercise. So it's a kind of experience that can have positive effects throughout the lifespan. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, research finds these effects. Are these benefits automatic? So do they happen in all cases? Do they happen every time a child grows up with two languages, for example? Well, actually, the benefits are not found in all studies, right? So there are studies that don't find some of these benefits. And it's because bilingualism is not a black and white thing. It's not the case, as we said before, that you're either bilingual or not, right? Bilingualism is not categorical. It's a continuum. We've said that you are bilingual even if you have imperfect command of the two languages. So you can really talk about bilingualism as something that is non-categorical. It's a continuum variable, and it's not easily quantifiable, right? So there are many, many factors that can play a role. And we in research, everybody in research, is trying to understand. So, for example, two potentially relevant factors that people have been working on are, okay, a child grows up bilingual, but in what way? So what are the patterns of language use in the family, for example? Are both parents speakers of a minority language? Or does one parent speak one language and the other parent speaks another language? And what do they decide to do with their children? Do they speak only the minority language? Does each parent speak their own language? Do they ever switch? How much switching is there? Or in society, do children grow up in a bilingual place where the languages are rigidly separated? Sardinia is one. So Sardinian is spoken at home. Outside the home, you speak Italian. In other bilingual communities, Catalonia, for example, the two languages are much more mixed. And you can speak both languages in all contexts, right? So very different patterns of use in the family or in society. And the attitudes that people have are very important. Children are incredibly sensitive to what people think about their languages. They're being bilingual. They don't want to feel different. Very often when they start school, especially in a country like this, they feel different because the majority of children are not bilingual. Things are changing because I know that there are schools here in Edinburgh where the majority of children, in fact, are bilingual or come from other places. But it's important to have positive attitudes in the family. It's important to be on board with your child when you're trying to raise his or her, him or her as bilingual. So positive attitudes sometimes are not there, and that affects bilingualism even in ideal circumstances. So I'm coming to an end. What are the implications of everything that I've been talking about? There are important implications for everybody. So there are important implications for families, for policymakers who come up with legislation and new ways of introducing languages in schools. There are implications for multilingual classrooms. Many more teachers now teach in classrooms that are attended by children from many different places. Regional minority languages, as we said, many of these languages are declining because they're not spoken to children anymore. So in the family, we know that sometimes, families, positive families, think, okay, I speak one language, my partner speaks another language. Of course our child is going to be bilingual, right? And then, several months later, you discover that the child is not bilingual. And you discover that the parent who speaks the minority language is almost never there. They spend maybe half an hour at home. So the child doesn't really hear that language very much. And it doesn't matter if the parent speaks it, if the child doesn't hear it. So a child needs enough exposure to both languages, enough engaging exposure, because remember, children don't need boring language lessons. Children need to be engaged with the language. They need to be motivated to speak the language. They need to have fun. They need to have a reason for wanting to speak the languages. One thing that research has found is that hearing the language from different people is very important. So, in the most extreme cases, the child hears the minority language from one person, the parent who speaks that language, but nobody else, because there's no community. I was in Air yesterday speaking to parents, and there was a mother whose native language is Hebrew. And she was telling me, I would love to socialize with other families that speak Hebrew, but there are none. And Air is not like Edinburgh, right? So it's a much more smaller town. So it's much more difficult to create a mini community where children can hear the language, not just from their parent, but from other people. Think about how normal it is for a monolingual child, growing up here, for example, and learning English. They hear the language from everybody. Young people, old people, males, females, children, adults, different registers, different accents. This is what we call normal variation. And in the minority language, very often that normal variation is not there. So we always advise people to create a mini community. 3 speakers is better than 1 already, because 3 speakers will speak in different ways. And there will be a little of that normal variation. And again, positive attitude that I've already mentioned. Language learning at school. We are working with the Scottish government and we collaborated with them on their 1+2 plan that has been in operation since 2014, so already 3 years. And the 1+2 plan, as the name suggests, aims to introduce 2 languages in primary school, in addition to number 1, which is the native language. So the first language introduced in primary 1, so at age 5, and the second language 5 years later. Now, we worked on the plan and with them, and now we're working on the implementation of the plan. And the implementation of the plan is challenging, as you can imagine. So, first of all, children learn differently at different ages. So, a 5-year-old doesn't learn in the same way as an 11-year-old or a 10-year-old, because a lot goes on in terms of cognitive development between those ages. So it's important for teachers to know something about how children learn languages at different ages, but they typically don't. Typically, the time of exposure is 1 hour a week. So not very much exposure. We did evaluation studies of Mandarin. So in a bunch of schools, how much Chinese can a child learn if they hear Chinese 1 hour a week? Surprisingly, they do learn something, but you have to be realistic. So that isn't enough exposure. So if the government really wants people to be multilingual here, as the plan suggests, they should actually allow more time. They should allow more resources and more exposure in schools rather than just a symbolic, let's tick this box, it's 1 hour a week. Teachers should be properly trained. Many teachers, first of all, there aren't enough teachers, right? Because we're going from no language teaching at all to teaching 2 languages to everybody. By 2020, all Scottish schools will have the 1+2 in place. Where are the teachers? You have to find enough teachers. In many cases, there aren't enough teachers. So what happens is that existing teachers are retrained, they're converted into language teachers. And they don't like it because that's not what they wanted to do in the first place. And very often they don't speak the language well enough. And so parents don't like it either. So teachers should be found and properly trained, and parents should be informed. So if parents are not on board, as we said, if they're not supporting their children, then it's more difficult for a child to learn. So parents should be informed about the benefits of learning languages, especially in a country like this, where the status of English suggests for too many people that what's the point of learning other languages? And given financial restrictions and economic shortages, why investing in languages instead of investing in important things? So I've heard this many times. Important subject matters are science and maths, primarily. So why not investing in more science and more maths instead of investing in languages? But what we've been showing so far is that investing in languages actually can improve your scientific thinking. It can improve the way you do science. No matter what kind of science you do, you're better at paying attention. You're better at excluding irrelevant information. You have more flexibility. You're better at prioritize. All these things that are important, no matter to what kind of science you do. Anyway, so these are problems of language learning at school. Migration. Many families come from other countries, and they experience the pressure not to speak their home language. First of all, this pressure is internalized very often. So they think, right, I come here, my child has to have all the opportunities to learn English. They want their child to do well. They want their child to integrate. And they think their language is a problem. So very often they bring themselves, they stop speaking their language and they start speaking a language that they themselves don't master because they themselves are learning. So they speak imperfect, broken English. Is that good for the children? No, it's not. It's not good from the point of view of family communication and family dynamics because the communication is clearly impoverished. But it's not good from the point of view of bilingualism because maintaining the home language potentially gives children the benefits of bilingualism. A child who comes here and hears enough English learns English, but they don't have to hear it from the parents. They have to hear it from other places and other speakers. The distinction between prestigious and non-prestigious bilingualism is ill-founded, as we said before. So this distinction between bilingualism with two high-status languages versus bilingualism with a standard language and a dialect or a regional minority language. What's a dialect? A dialect is a political term, again. A dialect is usually a variant that is typologically close to the standard language. It's like a language. It's called a dialect, and the term dialect is not doesn't have positive connotations usually, but that's a political distinction. It's not a cognitive distinction. So we have to get rid of this distinction, and we have to encourage bilingualism, first of all, because in many cases it's vital for maintaining the minority language. Many minority languages are dying, and many more will die. It's absolutely predictable, and in the longer run, there's nothing that we can do. But as long as there are enough young people who can speak the language to their children, it's worth their while to do so, because they maintain the transmission of the language to the next generation. If that transmission stops, the language dies, and there's nothing we can do about that. But speaking the minority language, as we said before, gives children the benefits of being bilingual. And so I've really said everything I can, possibly more than we wanted to hear. I just wanted to say what we are actively doing to bridge the gap between research and society, as I said at the beginning. So we have this center that I started 9 years ago. It's called Bilingualism Matters. And I started small. I was worried as a parent more than anything else about how little people know about bilingualism. And so I thought, well, we have some responsibility in research because you can't blame people for not knowing if nobody bothers to tell them, if nobody bothers to make the research accessible. So we have a responsibility. I've decided, okay, let's do this from parents and teachers in Edinburgh. And very soon I was overwhelmed with requests for information from many more places, many more sectors of society. So health professionals, policymakers, and now businesses. So we deal with the whole lot of, sectors of society. We are regularly, we do advice, we give advice, public engagement and policy. We are regularly in the media, and we have a very large international network. We have, at the moment, 18 branches. A 19th branch will be open soon. I was in California 2 weeks ago, and I opened our third North American branch. So we have an opportunity to exchange good practice about bridging the gap between research and society in different places, with different political contexts, different languages, but the issues are pretty much the same. And these are some of the partnerships and collaborations that we have: Scottish Government, charities, the private sector. We work with Pearson now, Pearson Education, the Financial Times. We have an ongoing collaboration where they organize events with the business world, and they put us in touch with companies and chief executives, but also the NHS Scotland and so on. And we have a number of projects that are very often funded by the European Commission. And I hope that this will continue for a long time. Despite Brexit, it's really a worry for us. But at the moment, we have a lot of funding from the European Commission, but not only. We get partly funded by other bodies, so the American National Science Foundation, the Carnegie Trust, the Leverhulme Trust, and a number of other sponsors and funders. And we do research, in collaboration with other people on different aspects of multilingualism. And this is it. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have questions. Yes.
So you talked about the negative aspects of putting one language on a pedestal on bilingualism. Like, for instance, English, do you think then that the benefits of having an international language don't outweigh the negatives? Or what's your point of view on that? Do you think the positives of having one language that people can learn to use wherever they go? Well, are there positives, or are the positive potential outweighed by the negatives?
I think there are certainly positives in having lingua franca, being able to communicate, despite language barriers, but that shouldn't have to be at the expense of bilingualism and maintaining the other languages. So we're not talking about replacing, languages with a lingua franca or English or whatever. English enjoys this status now. We don't know what will happen, in 100 years. I mean, it's totally dependent on political circumstances, right? So Chinese is gaining ground, maybe other languages will gain ground. But, so it's good to have a lingua franca, and I've never had any objections to that. It's a language of science, it's a language that we use at conferences, and it's very good to have that way of communicating, across borders and so on. But at the same time, that shouldn't be inconsistent with maintaining other languages and encouraging multilingualism in the majority of people, so that they can still use a lingua franca, but at the same time, they can speak the other languages as well.
Also, why do you think this? Why do you think was it Esperanto? What?
Yeah, Esperanto never really took off. I know people who speak Esperanto, but it's definitely not, what people hope. Yeah, I think, from the practical point of view, I mean, a language doesn't really become a language unless it's learned by children. I think, so very few children actually learn Esperanto, which means that, very few parents actually speak Esperanto to their children. So unless, that happens, you can't really talk about the expansion of Esperanto. So it still remains, a language that very few people know. usually adults. Yes.
Do you think that in Scotland we're going to actually get anywhere with the, do you think we have more hours spent in language teaching unless we change the way that we do it, or is that already part of the plan? Because the way that we teach languages in this country seems to be much less effective than the way English is. Well, it must be less effective than the way English is taught in other countries.
Well, I wouldn't. I didn't say anything about how the way languages are taught, which is very important. I completely agree. So methodologies. That's why I think teachers should be trained, and that means that methods should be adapted, on the basis of how children learn and what is known about how children learn. Very often methods are not consistent, with research and so on. So the way languages are taught has an influence on how they're learned. I wouldn't say that Scotland is particularly, much worse than other places in Europe. I can tell you something about Italy, for example, how languages are taught in Italy. And, there are problems there too, but possibly in other countries as well. So there's a lot of room for improvement in the way, teaching languages can change if it's informed by research. So that's why, we talk about, and we do participate in teacher training courses, for example, where at least, it's not the only thing that teachers need to know. Obviously, they need to know, they have elements of pedagogy and so on, but they also need to know about how children learn languages at different ages. So yes, that's an important element. I don't think that Scotland is particularly disadvantaged in this respect in a European context. And I think that what we need to change, apart from teaching, improving teaching, is changing attitudes and really persuading people that this is a form of investment for the future and for the lifetime, and not just something that if it's there, it's fine. If it's not there, it's fine too, because underlyingly, we don't care about languages. That is what needs to be changed. I think there's a question there.
You said that children don't get confused.
Can you speak up a bit?
You said that children don't get confused by learning two languages at once. How many languages can you teach before they really do get confused?
We can do an experiment. It would be difficult to get ethical approval. First of all, you don't teach languages to children. I think that's the wrong term. Parents don't teach languages. Parents speak language. Parents, for example, don't correct their children very much. They're much more concerned with the content, the message that they're getting across, or what the message that their child is getting across, or trying to get across. They're not really very concerned with form, so teaching is not the right term to use in this context. How many languages can a child learn? I think that's what you're asking. As I said, children need to hear enough of all languages. So, how many waking hours are there during the day? So, if you have one language only, the whole time is taken by that language. If you have two languages, roughly, you have a rough equal distribution, 50% in one language and 50% of the time in the other language. If you have three, less time for each language. So ultimately, it's not that the brain can't cope, but, there isn't enough time to give meaningful exposure or enough input in each of these languages. I think we have, people here who have experience of multiple languages in their household. I don't know if, Kat, you want to say something, because you have quite a number of languages in your household, right? Like 5?
It's a challenge. We forget to be one language.
Yes. So you both speak your own language to the children? Yeah. But Kat and her husband speak German to each other, but not to the children. And the children go to the Gaelic school, and there's English everywhere. So, yeah, I think you have to be realistic in that case. Again, you can't expect a child like that to to be equally proficient in all these languages. It's impossible. So some languages will be ahead than others. Then if the situation changes, and if the child gets more input in the language that was initially behind, that language takes over, or even becomes even dominant over the others. So the relevant degree of proficiency and balance changes over time, and it's flexible. I think you had a question. Can you speak up a bit, sorry? Yes, I mean, bilingualism doesn't include necessarily biliteracy. Okay, what you're talking about is full biliteracy. So being able to not only to read but to write in both languages. That doesn't come naturally and easily. So reading is one thing, and we always tell parents, try to read books, introduce, read books in the other language, in whatever the other language other than English is. And children can learn to read in both languages, and they don't get confused. I mean, they never, try to, read Italian as if it was English or read English as if it was Italian, because they learn, how the conventions are for each language. But writing is a different matter, because writing really has to be done and practiced. So typically, writing skills are achieved in the language of schooling only. But it depends on what parents want, and all families are different. So in my family, we didn't bother very much with writing in Italian because, my sons never went to school in Italy. We didn't have plans, to move to Italy. Now they can write. I mean, they can write, sometimes they make a mistake. If they lived in Italy and had to write professionally, they would learn to write in Italian in the same way I learned to write in English. And because I do it all the time. And that has incidentally affected my ability to write in Italian because I never write in Italian. So, but it's not that writing automatically comes as a byproduct of speaking two languages or even reading in two languages. Yes?
What's a good way of learning a language as a later age group, so to say? What's a good way of learning?
A good way to learn a language?
From basics.
Yeah, well, so adults don't learn like children, exactly like children, because children learn without knowing that they're learning, especially young children, right? They have no awareness. So they learn in an implicit way. Adults can learn implicitly, and, many adults do learn a lot. As I said, much of what a proficient second language speaker knows is implicit. They're not aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it. But they also learn explicitly, so their ability to learn explicitly by thinking about language, first of all, by wanting to learn, so there is an intention to learn, and also there are cognitive mechanisms that can be employed to learn explicitly. So if you say that, it looks like, well, then they have an advantage, right? I mean, they have two ways of learning instead of one. And so why is it not an advantage? I think that there are other factors that play a role. First of all, time. So think of, the time that a child has, to hear a language, or even to hear two languages. They don't have many constraints. For an adult, it's a different story. I mean, full immersion, yes, you can have full immersion if you move to another country, but typically when adults start learning a language, they hear it 2 hours a week or an hour a week. That's very limited time. And so they have an advantage in terms of thinking about the grammar and learning explicitly, but they don't have much exposure to the language, and so learning implicitly is a bit more difficult. So the best thing, the best way to learn a language, would be to be able to combine explicit knowledge, which helps, and it's a shortcut in a way, but it's not everything, with actual hearing the language and being exposed to the language and having the opportunities to interact with people in the language, which for an adult is not always easy. Yes.
It's a nice example of learning. It's a nice example of learning. Scientists, what you find that you describe when he was growing up, his father, he was a scientist when he Nobel Prize. His father would take an object and would describe it in 5 different ways.
Mm-hmm.
He would use Latin and other languages. So what that allowed him to develop is to make a distinction between the language and the thing being described. So he's able to notice more. He wouldn't be able to bird. He knows details, his wings. And so that allowed him to be very creative. And he said it was a big part in allowing him to become the scientist that he was.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to ask, this is maybe a controversial question, but in the light of Brexit, do you think the fact that our country are, it's so bad at languages that perhaps has played a role or some sort of an influence in some way on the decision that this country has made?
Well, I think, that there may be a connection, between, a certain amount of insularity that led many people to vote for Brexit, and the feeling that you can be self-sufficient, and you don't really need to speak other people's language. Because, first of all, everybody speaks English, which is not even true. I was talking to high school students in school about a month ago, and I said, well, maybe you think that everybody speaks English in Europe, right? I'm going to show you a map, I don't have it here, of how widespread, how many people, percentages of people who actually do speak English in different European countries. And you get, very high percentages in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands. But, in other countries, it's really not very much at all. We're talking about 10% if we're lucky, right? So it's even not true that everybody speaks English. But I think, I think you're right that there is a connection between, the lack of interest in the self-sufficiency and the insularity that led to, this kind of vote, and lack of interest for foreign languages, unfortunately. So in a way, this is a dream, our aim, it's maybe totally idealistic, but ultimately we want to change attitudes, and changing attitudes, it's not just for languages. I think changing attitudes may have repercussions for other areas as well. Yes.
I'm looking at NHS medical services, and I'm particularly concerned about fallout of primary school kids, stress problems. I'm just wondering what research is being done in terms of knowledge.
You mean from the point of view of stress? Did I understand?
Well, the statistics are going 1 in 4. Is it the same that
Well, there are problems, especially for migrant children, who come from a different language background, but from a different culture and a different country. Of course, moving to a completely different environment can be very stressful. It's not just from a linguistic point of view, because they have to learn a new language, but also because they have to adapt to many, many differences. Language is important, though, and it's typically underestimated. So one thing that we would like to do in collaboration with, people who deal with migrants, so refugees, for example, is to emphasize the role of language. And so an understanding of, the linguistic background that these children have and their attempts to learn English and therefore to become bilingual, and whether that brings, a challenge and therefore also stress. So, sometimes children don't say anything in a classroom context. They don't participate because they understand but they don't speak and so they don't feel confident. So what is a teacher or a member of staff supposed to do in those situations? So clearly, they're not supposed to marginate that child. They're supposed to, understand that the child is learning more and more and they're exposed to more and more input. And if they don't say anything, it's okay. It may be a stage that they're going through. Interpreters are typically not experienced with dealing with stress. So many migrant people come from very stressful situations, and traumatic situations. So it's important for an interpreter to be able to appreciate that, not just, mechanically translate, from one language to the other, because the way distressed people use language, has to be understood and has to be taken into account. So we're trying to, provide these people who do this very difficult work of dealing with migration and migrants. We're trying to provide them with extra instruments that would allow them to do their work better. Yeah. Okay. 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 Yeah, I'm not an expert of this, in this domain. I certainly read that, the cases of early childhood stress are increasing, and they may be because of the demands that are made on children in particular education environments, and, an obsession with performance in exams and, finalizing everything, to exam performance. That can be a source of stress, certainly. And, I know as much about this as anybody who reads the papers, and but I don't work in this field. What I can try to do, from my perspective and my own area of expertise, is to help people, to make sure that multilingualism is possible in this society, and encouraging multilingualism, by looking at the advantages and the challenges as well, because it's not always easy. So, people have to be aware of the challenges as well, but they have to be aware of the benefits and so on. Yes?
You mentioned learning an extra language in context with aphesics, and I'm very interested in how I can improve my brain health, particularly as I've got a memory that's weak at points. Is learning another language a potential route for improving my memory and changing my relationship to, changing aspects of my dyslexia?
That's a difficult answer, right? Because, yes, there is research, some research, for example, on the relationship between bilingualism and dyslexia. Because, I think it's fair to say that the general medical advice for any kind of, atypical development, can be dyslexia, it could be autism, it could be specific language impairment, and so on, is to advise parents not to speak two languages. And we know this for a fact, that the general medical advice is, in these cases, you speak only one language. And it seems to be based on the early idea of confusion, right, or an effort. So, the brain, the child's brain makes an effort, that's the belief, in dealing with two languages. If there are other sources of stress and tension and so on, then you don't want to give them this problem. Now, there is more and more research on these conditions that show that this is not necessarily the good advice to give. Now, it's difficult to generalize because there are many different kinds of autism, many different kinds of dyslexia, so you can't, have a single piece of advice that, fits all. So you have to consider individual cases, but we need more research to understand, in which cases bilingualism could be actually beneficial and not just, not make any difference. Certainly not being damaging. So first of all, you have to demonstrate that it's not damaging. Second, it may be just completely irrelevant, if it's there or not. Third, it might actually be beneficial in some cases. So we're going to start a project on bilingualism and autism in January. So very happy to be doing that in collaboration with colleagues in the medical school. And so we'll be looking at, these different cases and so on. We hope to make some progress on this question. But it's very easy to, on the one hand, to idealize, the benefits, as I said, this is great, so we have a cure for all kinds of things. It's very easy to exploit this research from a commercial point of view, and there are lots of attempts, to sell products, selling, this is, if you do this, if you use this method, you get all these benefits, I think, we have to be very careful and we have to evaluate, these methods and be careful about what they're trying to sell.
What I very much pick up is exercise is good.
Yeah. And not just
activity.
Not just activity due to bilingualism or language learning. So language learning is a way to keep your brain fit, and so on. It's not the only way. And whether it improves memory, I can't really tell you, straight away. Does it improve memory? Yeah, maybe. In some people, in some cases. Yeah.
Could you speculate on the best teaching practices and cultural paradigms for multilingualism?
The best teaching
practices and cultural paradigms. So, what is the perfect scenario for encouraging bilingualism?
And that's another very difficult question, right? Because it depends on where you are, where. So, from that point of view, having an international network as we do allows us, in principle, to compare, what a good method might be, in different situations for different languages, in different political circumstances, for example, and so on and so forth. But I think, very generally, I think good teaching should be based on apart from many other things, good communication abilities, good empathy and so on, but a very good knowledge of, for languages in particular, of what happens in children at different ages when they learn a language. And this is typically knowledge that teachers don't have. But it's also knowledge that other professionals don't have. So speech therapists, for example, typically don't learn much about bilingual children. So this is changing a bit in this country, but in other countries it's still, there's a lot of work to do to make sure that these professionals have this knowledge. And so, what we're trying to do is to provide them, we can do their job, obviously, I know what my job is, but I'm not trying to do anybody's job, but I can try to provide an extra instrument for these people to make their professional decisions, on a stronger basis. So
you could inform the curriculum based on different stages of development.
For example, yes. And that's not the only element that informs the curriculum, of course, right? But it's an element that at the moment is missing. So that's what we are trying to, persuade several people, including Scottish government, that it would be worth investing in this sense. And it's worth at this point also looking at how much children learn in different schools and in different contexts. 3 years into the project, we have enough data to assess outcomes. And that should be done before we move any further, or before we take it for granted that the project works. Yes?
I just want to show because she and
Can you speak up a bit?
this is it, children. It's not a matter. I have this French, Italian, was a receipt German. And what she said to me is, what I was in France, I speak I can tell German accent.
So learning one language has positive effects on the other language.
Well, I basic school in the French, Italian, regularly, home, courses, when you like it says German, we speak German. That's true. That was my
No, I mean it could be a real thing, and we don't fully understand, why that happens. But there are ways in which learning a language can benefit, not necessarily or affect, has effect on other languages, not necessarily your first language or even the second language, but another related language, for example. So when my husband learned Italian. Which was before he met me. So he knew Italian, but his Romanian, was dominant at that point. And then, Italian started affecting his Romanian, but not his English, obviously, and not obviously, probably his English, according to what I was saying before, but not his German or other slightly typologically different languages. So it's possible that, activating or learning a language can also has effects on other languages that are not, in ways that we are still trying to understand. It's quite clear that, as I said, when you learn a language, your other languages change, in response to that experience. And they don't change across the board, they change in very particular ways. And so, that happens not only to the native language, but also to other non-native languages. But we need a lot more research on that. Yes?
This is kind of interesting. I was wondering, so your experience working with bilinguals, you must have met people who can speak a wide variety of languages. Do you often find that the language that you first communicate with them is the one you prefer to communicate with them, even if you down the road discover that they might speak Italian or they might speak another language you use? Do you find that once you've associated one way of communicating with them, that's the way you prefer to speak with them, even if it turns out they can speak Italian fluently?
I think that works more widely. That if you establish a relationship that works in one language, then it's more difficult to change that. I mean, that certainly happens in couples. So my relationship with my husband started in English, and it continued in English, and that's our main language of communication, even if his Italian is very good. So we used Italian with the kids, but between us, it's very difficult to change that first, the fact that our relationship was based in that language. So yeah, I think that, there are many factors that can affect that choice and not just language proficiency, but others. But once the choice is made, it can sustain.
Are there any further questions, or?
If you have any other questions that you might think of later on, please get in touch. Those are the ways to get in touch with us. And we're always happy to answer.
Well, a big thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We definitely encourage everybody to, when you go out on your travels, to point people towards the website and raise awareness of it. I found it's really actually a lovely way for me to interact with my godchildren, because I'm actually learning much more than they're learning from me. My one goddaughter learning Russian from cartoons, and it just threw me so much. It was amazing. I was like, "You have to teach me this," and it turned into a game. So, please, yeah, check out the website and spread the word about it. So we're now going to have a break, and at this point, I for those who have come to hear Jan Conway's talk on Taoism, terribly sorry, she's not been able to make it along tonight because of health matters. I've wished her all the best and that she gets well soon. And she said that she's going to come back in the spring and do her talk then. So instead, we've got two short presentations. Are you? Yeah? Are you game?
Yeah.
So we'll have some food, fill our glasses, and after say 20 minutes, you can come back and two very short presentations. Would you both like to tell the room what you're going to do your presentations about?
And I'm going to tell you that the picture, I live a picture, I am working on the minutes, and it's here that this.
I will talk about our startup, the Asian Scotland Partnership for the Environment, which is trying to catalyze a collaboration between Scottish and Asian environment